Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome, and thanks to all of you for joining us. It's a great pleasure to see so many good friends and close colleagues. We're very excited to be in the dark. No, I'm just kind of... Okay. We're very excited to launch the Dialogue's latest book this afternoon, Unfulfilled Promises, Latin America Today. The book is an effort to go beyond the daily or even the hourly, these days, news cycle, which is not easy to do, and even go beyond many of the specific policy reports the Dialogue regularly produces on our 5 program areas: rule of law, energy and climate change, education, Asia and Latin America, and migration, remittances, and development. The idea behind this book was to take a step back and take stock of Latin America's recent experience and performance on 6 salient cross-cutting themes and get a sense of where the region might be headed in the coming years. We did not pretend to produce a definitive account of a region that is increasingly diverse and heterogeneous and seems to be going in any number of different directions. There is enormous and indeed growing variation among the countries in Latin America. But we believe it's useful nonetheless to take a broad look and try to capture some of the region's trends and idiosyncrasies that perhaps contrast with other regions in the world. We want to produce a volume that is widely accessible and that would stimulate reflection and debate that eventually leads to a constructive agenda and a constructive path moving forward. As the title suggests, this volume is a sober, realistic, evidence-based assessment and interpretation of Latin America today. It recognizes important advances on many fronts, but also points out frustrations and setbacks and lack of sustained progress on critical issues. It points to the challenges that lie ahead, particularly in strengthening state capacity, which is a thread that runs throughout this volume. To pursue this exercise, we were very fortunate to engage 6 outstanding specialists who contributed chapters. Catalina Botero of Colombia, who wrote the chapter on democracy and the rule of law. Robert Muga, based in Brazil, wrote the chapter on crime and violence. George Gray Molina from Bolivia, who wrote on poverty and inequality. And Augusto La Torre and Alain Easy, who wrote on economic management and growth. And we're extremely delighted and honored to have Augusto de la Torre with us at the launch this afternoon. And I've asked him to share a few comments about his own chapter and also about the book as a whole. But we're glad to have him with us. Andres Malamud is from Argentina. He wrote on Latin America and the world. And Ana Covarrubias from Mexico has a chapter on regional integration. We were delighted also that President Laura Chinchilla agreed to write the introductory essay, which sets the tone and frames the book, I think, very well. Her title of her introduction, Latin America, a Pending Assignment. In any case, I want to thank all the contributors to this volume. I also want to express my profound gratitude to Bruno Binetti from Argentina, who skillfully coordinated this project, co-edited the volume, and co-authored the conclusion. Bruno's hard work, dedication, superb editing skills, and good humor are deeply appreciated and were critical to the success of this volume. At the Dialogue here, I also want to thank Irene Stefania and Missy Reith for the critical contribution towards the publication of the book. This volume is now being translated into Spanish and Portuguese. We are planning dissemination events in coming months in Rio de Janeiro and Mexico City, and perhaps Lima or Bogota. We hope to engage civil society and public and private sector leaders in these countries to stimulate spirited debate. None of this would have been possible without the generous support provided by the Ford Foundation. We are very grateful for the Foundation for their support of this effort. I can't imagine having 2 better people with us to launch this book and share their perspectives and insights about the region today than President Laura Chinchilla and Ambassador Tom Shannon, both Dialogue co-chairs as of January of this year. And all of our board members, all of the members of the dialogue, and our entire staff are so enthusiastic to have them with us to help steer the dialogue during a very uncertain and challenging period ahead. President Chinchilla was the president of Costa Rica from 2010 to 2014, the first woman to hold that position. She previously served as vice president, minister of justice, and also was a member of the National Assembly. She is extremely active these days in regional and international organizations like the OAS, the UN, and the Club de Madrid. And we're so lucky to have her with us at the dialogue. Thank you, President Chinchilla. Tom Shannon is a very distinguished diplomat with a remarkable career in the Foreign Service. He served as U.S. Ambassador to Brazil and also Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs. As Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Ambassador Shannon was the highest-ranking Latin Americanist, true Latin Americanist, ever to serve in the U.S. government. When I travel to the region, I'm always struck, but not too surprised, by how much he is respected and admired for his great achievements. Ambassador Shannon is now working here in Washington with Arnold and Porter. Thank you, Tom, for doing this. We'll first hear from President Chinchilla about her essay, and then I'll turn it over to Ambassador Shannon for a commentary before opening up to all of you for what I'm sure will be a good exchange. So thank you all for joining us. President Chinchilla, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. I usually try to avoid reading, except when I speak English. So you will allow me to read some of the notes I prepare for this presentation, which is basically based on the introduction. And I thank Mike for having asked me to be part of this important book that we are presenting today. And most of you probably are wondering why this title and also why this picture in the cover. Well, I'm going to talk about this building in a certain way. In 1992, in commemoration of the 500-year anniversary of Christopher Columbus' first voyage to the Americas, Mexican writer Carlos Fuentes wrote one of the most notable essays ever written on Ibero-American history entitled El Espejo Enterrado, The Buried Mirror. In this essay, he compared the region's troubled past to the construction of a tall building in Mexico City, a building that is never fully finished in spite of gradual, permanent progress. The construction of Latin America, he claimed, was just as incomplete. It was a work that was advancing yet unfinished, energetic yet fraught with seemingly insoluble problems. Over 25 years have passed since Fuentes' seminal essay. Most countries in the region find themselves amidst the opposite commemoration, the bicentennial of their independence. Yet it is fair to say that the image of that unfinished building continues to be the most accurate depiction of Latin American reality. Our inability to carry out plans and objectives, our difficulty to finish tasks, our propensity to improvise and to look for the easy way out instead of finding long-term solutions continue to be the sign of our predicament. These problems are not exclusive to Latin America, but we can think of few other places where there is such a strong sense of wasted opportunity. Latin America is a region particularly identified with unfinished business, unfulfilled promise, and untapped potential. Throughout history, some Latin American countries have stood at the threshold of success. Some have experienced episodes of unprecedented economic growth. Others have attained remarkable development goals. But each time a new economic recession, a new political breakdown, a new social upheaval has undermined their achievements and sent them back years, if not decades. Like a Sisyphean tale, they have reached the peak of the mountain only to come tumble down again. Argentina, by the first 2 decades of the past century, ranked among the 10 richest nations in the world, ahead of France, Germany, and Italy. Its per capita income was 92% of the average of the 16 richest economy. And even during the second post-war period, it was still the 5th largest economy in the world. After years of economic ups and downs, Argentina's per capita income is 43% of those same 16 rich economies. But probably the most visible and tragic example of economic and social decline is Venezuela. By 1970, this country had become the richest in Latin America and one of the 20 richest nations in the world. In contrast, today, with an inflation rate of more than 1 million% and a gross domestic product growth rate of minus 15 or 20 for 2018, Venezuela is suffering a humanitarian crisis of severe shortages of food, medicine, and medical supplies, and thousands of Venezuelans flee the country daily. It is possible to find many other examples in almost all of our nations confirming this kind of erratic trajectory, not only in our economic performance, but also in our social and political development. Long periods of stability, prosperity, and institutional consolidation in Latin America have been interrupted by episodes of economic stagnation, social unrest, authoritarian rule, and human rights violations. This doesn't necessarily mean that progress and improvements are largely absent. Rather, it means that either positive change takes place at an extremely slow pace, or policy normally fail to trigger meaningful, in-depth, transforming dynamics. In this book, we analyze several aspects of the regional agenda, and in each of them, we are able to find that even if there are some achievements to celebrate, the pending challenges are many and of great importance. Regarding the economy, Augusto de la Torre recognizes that Latin America performance has historically been uninspiring. Most recently, by the beginning of the current century, we were witnesses of an impressive economic growth. For example, between 2003 and 2011, overall per capita income in the region rose by 3% on average, and our share in the world economy rose from 5% to 8% in that period. However, since 2013, the tide turned, and optimism and euphoria transformed into caution and concern. Ever since Latin America's boom came to a sudden end, some countries had to struggle to avoid negative growth rates, while others faced modest to minimal growth. It is frustrating to see how regional growth has fallen short of that of the world economy and how other nations, such as the Asian tigers, passed us many years ago. In the La Torre's world, Latin America countries continue to suffer from volatility, low growth, and high inequality. Something similar happens when analyzing Latin America's social performance. As George Gray Molina puts it, this is an area where we found mountains and valleys. Certainly, the economic success during the first decade of the century translated into social achievements. Between 2002 and 2012, poverty in the region fell from 44% to 29%, unemployment was reduced by 35%, and the middle class expanded from 22 to 34% of the population. Moreover, unlike other regions, Latin America managed to reduce income inequality during the same period with an overall decline of about 3 points in its Gini coefficient. However, as Gray Molina recognizes, some of the progress was reversed during the slow down period. While 35 million people moved upward, Between 2013 and 15, close to 80 million moved downward. 11 million became part of the vulnerable class, and 7 million dropped under the poverty line. He adds that this leaky bucket effect is ominous because it suggests that the gains in poverty reduction are fragile after the end of the boom. A third challenge that this publication highlights is improving public governance while strengthening our democratic institutions and the rule of law, the cornerstones of any serious endeavor to generate political stability and build countries and societies where human dignity is fully guaranteed. Referring specifically to the rule of law, Catalina Botero states that some areas have seen precious little progress, while others have experienced a disturbing backslide. When the last wave of democratization swept the region in the 1980s, we expected governments to embrace the rule of law and become more accountable and transparent after citizens regained the right to decide their own destiny through the ballot. Yet some countries in Latin America were unable to move past the basic outline of electoral democracies. They fell short of safeguarding freedom of the press, building a robust system of checks and balances, and enforcing accountability. According to the Freedom House, only 3 countries in the region enjoy free press conditions, while the rest have partially free press guarantees or lack a free press environment. As to accountability, 6 nations, that means a third part of our countries, lag at the very bottom of international transparency indexes. Instead of devising new ways to expand democracy, some governments have come up with new ways to undermine it, and others just decided not to make additional significant progress in this field. Finally, we cannot avoid referring to the issue of violence and criminality, an area where we also find insufficient advances and alarming setbacks. It is a paradox that Latin America, in spite of being a region without armed conflicts, with one of the lower rates of military expenditure and free of nuclear weapons, constitutes at the same time the most violent region of the world in terms of homicide rates per capita. In our cities, a sort of low-intensity war is being fought, with high mortality rates and excessive economic, social, and political costs. As Roberto Muga reminds us in the chapter dedicated to analyze the problem, the regional homicide rate is at least 3 times the global average. 8 of the top 10 most violent countries on the planet are in Central America and the Caribbean, and just 4 countries in the region account for 27% of the world's murders. He also presents the complexities of this problem and how is that in the region can coexist on one hand citizen security initiatives which aim to tackle the social causes that fuel violence with the traditional hardline policies known as mano dura on the other. The book includes 2 additional aspects of our agenda to which I have not referred, but that present the same kind of paradoxes, such as the topics of integration analyzed by Ana Covarrubias, and one related to our relationship with the rest of the world, written by Andrés Malamud. I don't refer either to the alternative policies and recommendations we actually formulate in the publication. I have to leave something out as an incentive for you to get and read the book. Dear friends, with this publication, we don't want to say that all countries in the region face the same odds, or what we are inexorably doomed to a mediocre route of development. Despite the many challenges we share, some countries have advanced considerably, growing at a more competitive and sustainable rates, improving the well-being of their citizens, implementing open government initiatives that bring transparency and efficiency to public administration, and fighting corruption, violence, and impunity. We also find good practices in many fields that are true examples of effectiveness. There are grounds for cautious optimism, at least for a group of nations that could be able to build on the progress achieved in the past. Clearly, none of the pending tasks we have mentioned is easy to accomplish. Development will always be somewhat unfinished goal. But there are clear signs indicating the path we need to take, and there are proven recommendations we can follow. We hold the key to unraveling over the 500 years of unfulfilled promises. Let us think critically about ourselves. Let us dig up the buried mirror and take a long, hard look at our faults and limitations. And then let us build on our strengths and foster our virtues. Those aims are the ones that lead the work we present today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, President Chinchilla. Ambassador Shannon, turn to you.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, President Chinchilla, for your very incisive comments reflecting what you wrote in the introduction, and I believe laying out starkly both the opportunities and challenges that Latin America faces and all of those who care about Latin America face. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here with all of you today and really look forward to this discussion. This is a rich topic and a remarkable book. Recently, I had the pleasure of being in De Pere, Wisconsin, which is in the larger Green Bay area, participating in a Great Decision Series colloquium. It's a several-week event that takes place around the United States, addressing some of the larger foreign policy dilemmas or challenges that the United States faces. And I went out to Wisconsin to talk about the U.S.-Mexico relationship. And as a basis for the discussion that took place there, the Great Decision Series used an article written by Michael Shifter and Bruno Binetti called the U.S.-Mexico, A Troubled Partnership. It was a remarkable document, a remarkable article that I think captured in an incredibly comprehensive and thoughtful way the history of the U.S.-Mexico relationship, but also the current challenges that it faces and the expectations for its future. And it was a spirited discussion that involved not only students and faculty from St. Norbert's College and the University of Wisconsin at Green Bay, but also many members of the community who came in for a larger discussion. Who would have thought that in the Dairyland of the United States, the U.S.-Mexico relationship would have been such an attractive evening, especially while it was snowing. But when Michael asked me to participate in this event and showed me an advanced copy of a book edited by the same two people who had written this excellent article on Mexico, I decided, well, I can't pass this up. It's going to be too good. And as I read through the book, my instincts were confirmed. It was, I think, a wonderfully edited book with a remarkable group of authors, all Latin Americans or Ibero-Americans. And they bring to this book, I think, not only trenchant analysis, but also the expectation and hope that they had obviously all had and I think still do have in Latin America's future, but also a tinge of bitterness about what had not been accomplished. I spent most of my diplomatic career in Latin America, but for the past 5 years, I globalized in a remarkable and rapid way and spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia, throughout the Horn of Africa and Central Africa, and also in the Middle East and in South and Central Asia. And I can tell you that Latin Americans are their own harshest critics. And if they would spend a little more time elsewhere in the world, they would realize that they've accomplished a lot. And that actually they're pretty well put together compared to the rest of the world. which is not a criticism of Unfulfilled Promises. Quite the contrary. For me, this book underscores the incredible self-awareness of this hemisphere and of the Americas in particular, and the understanding that in order to make democracy meaningful in this hemisphere, we have to fulfill those promises. And in this regard, President Chinchilla said just about everything that needs to be said. So I'm going to get us to the discussion part of this event pretty quickly, but I do have 3 comments to make. And the first is that I believe that this is a hemisphere and a region which, having made extraordinary progress in consolidating democratic governance and extraordinary progress in fashioning market economies and regionally integrating these economies, is now facing an even bigger challenge. And that is how you use democratic government to create democratic societies. In other words, how do you show that democracy is not a status quo form of governance, but actually a revolutionary form of government that can create a mechanism for social and economic and political transformation, but do it within a peaceful construct, do it within an ordered constitutional environment. And if there is a tinge of bitterness or disappointment in Unfulfilled Promises, I believe it is that. I believe it is a concern that democratic governments still face very significant challenges in creating these democratic societies. And in this regard, especially as we face a region where the middle class has grown dramatically, we are entering into a period of time in which ideological claims for votes are going to be less and less meaningful. But what will be meaningful is accomplishments. In other words, what leaders and political parties and governmental systems can accomplish. And in this regard, I believe that in this region, as it attempts to find a way to use democratic government to address problems of poverty, inequality, and social exclusion, we are looking at a moment in which democracies are expanding beyond political process and electoral systems and are actually building a second level of legitimacy. And that legitimacy lies not only in the proper functioning of elections and the proper transfer of power and the proper recognition of human rights and of the role of different branches of government. It also lies in what governments deliver. In other words, the question is, can democracy deliver the goods? And in many ways, Latin America and the Americas is the battleground of this important effort to use democracy as a socially transformative form of government. And therefore, it is incumbent upon us all, not just Latin Americans, but also Americans and Canadians and Caribbeans, to have this experiment be successful. Because if it fails here, if it fails in the Western Hemisphere, it won't work anywhere. So therefore, I think that this is an important primer at this point in laying out what has been accomplished and what needs to be accomplished, and what more we can all do in order to accomplish it. My other 2 points refer to the 2 chapters that President Chinchilla kindly did not mention, which is Andres Malamud's chapter on Latin America and the world, and Ana Covarrubias' chapter on Latin American integration, or what she calls circumstantial regionalism. They're both excellent chapters. And without going into too much detail, what struck me about Malamud's chapter is that in many ways, the globalization of Latin America is the untold story of the 21st century. And when it is told, especially when it's told from a United States point of view, it's always told in terms of the intervention of foreign powers into the region, especially China and Russia, to a certain extent Iran. That's not the story. The story is really outward facing. It's how this region has connected through free trade agreements, through the Alliance of the Pacific, by reaching across the Pacific into the large markets of Asia, and in Brazil's case, reaching across the Atlantic into Africa and into the Middle East, where a region is globalizing at a very fast rate, but it's doing so as democracies and as free markets and as countries that are committed in one way or another to regionalisms. And as they do this, as the South America in particular finds itself stretched, both east and west, the diplomacy that they have constructed internally to try to ensure that South America is not torn asunder in the process is quite remarkable and shows a degree of creativity and innovation and a certain wisdom in the people and in the voters that is striking. And therefore, I recommend this chapter because it captures, I think, in its complexity, the challenges of globalization. And in the chapter on Latin American integration, Ana Covarrubias walks us through all of the remarkable efforts at communication and integration that have taken place really since the beginning of the democratization process. And what is striking for me as a diplomat, looking at what has happened in this hemisphere, is how democracy has required countries to speak to each other in ways that they were reluctant to do so or unable to do so previously. And that this has generated a remarkable set of institutions, some formalized, some informalized, which have allowed nations, as they reshape their national interests because of the democratic ferment that's taking place in their countries, to carry that ferment and to carry these democratic aspirations into their conversations. Now, in the process of this creativity, many of these attempts at commingling and of sharing are going to break down and break apart, especially if they're fashioned at a particular political moment for a particular political purpose. But what we're seeing is that there are several which seem to have the ability to preserve themselves over time. Some of them are new, like the Alliance of the Pacific. Some of them are old, like the OAS and the Summit of the Americas process. But I think that although the author understands this in circumstantial terms, and what in life is not circumstantial, I think that actually it highlights the creativity and the dynamism of the societies that we're dealing with, and a clear recognition that these societies have to find ways to connect and communicate if Latin America as a region is going to find a way to shape and fashion diplomatic processes that are meaningful for the region itself and that allow it in a world that is globalizing and fragmenting at the same time to be able to protect itself and protect its interests and not be overwhelmed by external actors who not only find ways to establish boundaries and direction, but also have ways to extract resources at an important moment, not only in economic development, but political development for the region. So let me just close by, first of all, recommending this book, recommending it highly. It should be read with, I think, interest and with attention to detail, because I learned a lot while reading it. I love the cover to a certain extent. I love the story about Carlos Fuentes. I might have put a cathedral here because that's still unfinished, but it is worthy of God, and so is Latin America. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Good suggestion. That's the next volume.
Right.
Great. Well, we have about just about a half hour for discussion, comments, and questions. Let me call on Augusto La Torre, who has been cited here and contributed a great chapter on economic management and growth. As all of you know, Augusto was for many years the chief economist for Latin America and the Caribbean at the World Bank, and he's now teaching at Columbia University in New York. So I'm glad he's in Washington. Augusto.
Thank you very much. And thank you for allowing me to complement this very great summary that President Chinchilla and Ambassador Shannon have done. I have to say first that I noticed that there has been kind of an emotional wave around this book, because initially we were told the title was going to be A Latin American Narrative, which is a much more neutral title. Right? And now it's Unfulfilled Promises, and it's a unfinished building. And I think probably the editors, as they read the chapters, moved from a little bit towards more the somber view of Latin America. And there's quite a bit to be concerned about Latin America in this book. In writing the chapter on growth, I was struck by the fact that really Latin America falls behind the world after the Second War. Remarkably, until the Second War, Latin America was as prosperous as Italy, and as Spain. So something happened after the Second War that pushed the region behind, and we were left behind. In the book, we argue that a lot has to do with the fact that Latin America was unable to put together an outward-looking growth strategy. And of course, you can see that in Southern Europe, in Eastern Europe, and in the East Asian countries, that the secret of growth was to have a very, very aggressive outward-looking development strategy that Latin America was unable to follow, and partly it was because we're rich in commodities. When you have commodities, you can export a commodity and use those proceeds to import a lot. So for some reason, having commodities was itself a hindrance to having an outward-looking growth strategy. And the Southeast Asian countries did not have commodities, so the only way they could survive was by exporting, and they figured it out. China was a big event. This is something that perhaps was not mentioned sufficiently here, but from our work on growth in Latin America, China transformed the world, and we are only digesting the implications of China. China was part of a huge globalization process for emerging markets. And the globalization during that China boom, let's say, was quite beneficial to poor countries in Africa and to middle-income countries around the world, but was not good for the rich countries. So a lot of what's happening in the world now has a lot to do with the asymmetric effects that globalization has had on the world. It has been good for the poor and emerging markets. It has not been good for the rich countries. And that creates a tension that's going to make our lives more complicated going forward. Perhaps one piece of good news is that when you look at the last 25 years, there are some countries in Latin America that have had quite a bit of success from the economic point of view. And it's not necessarily the countries in South America. You think, the South American countries export commodities, they did great during China time. No. When you look at the chapter, you will find that there were some commodity exporters that did very poorly, and some commodity importers that actually did very good. So if you want the names of the ones that did good, let me tell you, it's very easy. There are 3 countries in South America, which are Chile, Peru, and Uruguay. They converged quite a bit towards the standards of living of the developed countries during the last 25 years or so. And in Central America, you have Costa Rica, Panama, and the Dominican Republic. Those are the success stories. Unfortunately, the big countries didn't do well, particularly Mexico. Mexico actually fell behind over the past 25 years. And that's a big puzzle because Mexico did everything that one would expect it to do. It joined NAFTA, it opened up, it's the neighbor across the Rio Grande, so one would expect Mexico to have done well. And Mexico has actually done well in terms of trade, but something doesn't work inside the economy. And then you have the Central American countries which have all gone in the direction of exporting services, including tourism, but not only tourism. And then you also have a huge bifurcation. You have some countries like Panama and Costa Rica who have done well on the basis of exporting services and more sophisticated products. And then you have Guatemala, El Salvador, that have fallen behind dramatically. So the region has become much more heterogeneous. And our future is going to lie on our ability to look outward and to connect to international markets, to sell goods and services to a more complicated world. But the way is actually very complicated because the rich countries are not doing well with globalization. So we may be facing a period where the rich countries fight against openness as the region needs to open up. So that's one of the big messages of this.
Terrific. Thank you, Augusto. I'm sorry we changed the title on you. And we read your chapter and we said, Unfulfilled Promises. There it is, all through the chapter. So we have 15 minutes, so why don't we collect some questions? Please just tell us who you are and be brief, and then we'll return to Ambassador Shannon and President Chinchilla for response.
My name is Carmen Iribarren Calcaño Borges. I am from Venezuela. Ambassador Shannon, I understand you were in Venezuela a few years ago as ambassador to the U.S. What happened?
We have another question here.
So you're asking the questions first?
Yes, I will get to collect them.
Thank you. So my name is Mauricio Vasquez, originally from Colombia, and I have a question for both, which is currently there are efforts by Colombia and Chile to have a new multilateral body called PROSUR that seems to be a replacement of UNASUR. So in light of the comments that you both made, two questions in one. First, do you think a new organization is needed? And if so, what would be the elements for this one to actually be successful in South America and promote this multilateral collaboration among the various countries that will be part of it? Thank you.
Okay. Other questions? Yeah.
Timothy Towell, 30 years in the State Department, most of it in Latin America. Madam President, former Secretary, Acting Secretary of State, Secretaries of State outrank ambassadors, Michael. My question is about the former Secretary of State's comment. Can democracy deliver the goods? We've had a lot of American presidents that one could argue were positive in their relations to the wonderful hemisphere. Teddy Roosevelt, Rutherford B. Hayes, remember him? No. FDR, and there's others that have been negative on it. I don't want to comment on today because we all can watch it on TV, especially on Sunday for 2.5 hours. But is the United States going to, in the future, going to be able to support this hemisphere and be with you when we're all working to deliver the goods? Or are we moving into a negative period, a counterproductive period that our grandchildren will resent?
Thank you very much. Any other questions or comments? No? Yes, please.
Sort of a follow-up to the last one. My name is Ken Meyercourt. Does the fact that the United States is currently threatening to intervene in yet another Latin American country, just like the good old days, suggest that things haven't changed so much?
Okay. There's nothing else. Yes, please, in the back, sir.
Hi, Francisco Quintana from Sehil. My question is about the Inter-American Democratic Charter. So one of the Unfulfilled Promises is the accomplishment of full democracies in the Americas. Is there a need for a reform of that charter? Is there a need for a new democratic charter? Thank you.
Okay. Peter, you want to say something? This is too optimistic for you? We get it. Well, wait for the microphone. Then you could ask.
I wouldn't have to use it. No. This is a general question, but Tom, you were sort of optimistic about Latin America, largely in terms of democracy. I mean, that was the central focus of, and Laura also. In other words, that this is a region that is still the most democratic in the world, and it seems to be able to hang on to the democracy. The question is the democratic institutions, the democratic processes, really gaining strength? Are they more resilient today than they were, let's say, in 1995 and 2005? Are we seeing a resilient democracy, or are we seeing one that sort of is more wobbly at this point?
Good. Thank you. Why don't we turn to Ambassador Shannon first and then to President Chinchilla?
I wish I'd been ambassador to Venezuela. I was something. I was something. I was the political counselor from 1996 to 1999. At the end of the presidency of Rafael Caldera, at the 1998 election,
Please.
Yeah, no, listen. I did hang out for a while, and I hanged out in the company of a variety of institutions and personalities, all attempting to find a way forward in the U.S.-Venezuela relationship, but also in addressing the political challenges presented by a government that was increasingly moving away from democracy to a more authoritarian or dictatorial form of government, and an opposition that was looking for a way forward to address the problems of Venezuela through electoral means. Regrettably, the several efforts that were made broke down over time. They broke down largely because of the determination of the government not to give in to an opposition that they saw as weak and fragmented and entirely dependent on an external support network. But we're now in a very different environment and a very different circumstance and situation. And I think everybody here is quite hopeful about what could happen and admiring of Juan Guaido, not only for his physical courage, but also for the intelligence that he and his colleagues have exercised in attempting to change the political basis of debate inside of Venezuela and move past the importance of finding or the immediacy of an electoral solution and instead moving to a transition based on the Constitution. The issue that is faced now in Venezuela, of course, is whether or not Juan Guaido and his supporters are going to be able to maintain this level of political mobilization and whether they're going to be able to find a way to transform the energy that is on the street into some kind of political organization and structure that will be able to challenge Maduro and those around him and convince the security services that a time for change has come. It's not at all apparent that that's going to happen. I think we're all hopeful of that, but it's not apparent. And this is why it's very important for Juan Guaido to be in Venezuela and not outside Venezuela. But it's also very important for the international community, and especially Latin America, to take an important role in support of a process of transition. The creation of the Lima Group, which really begins in coed manner at the end of the Obama administration, but then becomes one of the projects, the important projects of the Trump administration, really has changed, I think, in many ways, the understanding of the challenge that's being faced in Venezuela right now. And I say this because it took the Latin American countries, especially the countries of South America, a long time to understand or appreciate what was happening inside of Venezuela. Some of this was political, and some of this change in the region is the product of elections that have brought very different governments to power, especially in Brazil and Argentina. But the solidarity that exists currently in South America and much of Central America to support Venezuela at this particular moment is a very important accomplishment. And it's one that we, as the United States, should not put at risk. Which brings me to your question on intervention. We should not be talking about foreign intervention in Venezuela because it won't work and it will generate a cycle of instability that will be profoundly dangerous for the region, especially the larger Caribbean. But we can find a way to help Venezuelans achieve what it is they want to achieve. And I believe that is the big challenge we face right now. In regard to the other questions, PROSUR will last as long as UNASUR if it's only a political project. If it is only driven by the immediacy of the political moment. UNASUR was largely a Brazilian project. PROSUR would have a bit of an advantage in the sense that it would have a larger base to it. But ultimately, while it is interesting to try to find a way to link the countries of the region in a meaningful political project, its ability to gain traction and to become meaningful will depend, as I indicated earlier, really on accomplishments and not just on structures. And as far as democracy delivering the goods, I do not think the U.S. role is counterproductive. We're in a challenging moment right now because, as was noted, the impact of globalization on rich countries is really forcing countries like the United States to begin to retrench some of our trading relationships and not have the kind of drive to integrate markets and to open our own and open the rest of the region as would probably be necessary at this point in time. And it also limits us diplomatically because we have less and less to offer on the trade side. I mean, in a different kind of environment, why wouldn't we allow Argentina to sell lemons in the United States? Why wouldn't we create a pathway for Macri to be reelected by opening our markets to Argentine beef? I mean, it's pretty straightforward as far as I'm concerned. But we're in an environment where that is very difficult. But that said, the region itself has capabilities. And although interregional trade still has not reached, with maybe the exception of the Brazil-Argentina trade, the kind of trade levels that have deep impact on the economy, they can. And this is why the Alliance for the Pacific is such an important initiative. And then in terms of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, this was, I had the pleasure of negotiating that deal for the United States. And I still consider it to be a remarkable document for many reasons. One of the most important being that it actually declares democracy to be a right. This was quite controversial at the time. Democracy was understood to be a form of government that was built around certain rights like freedom of association and freedom of speech and freedom of belief. But the charter itself decided that democracy was going to be declared as a right. And then it was going to link the right of democracy to social and economic development by saying that democracy was essential to social and economic development. And from my point of view, that was another radical and dramatic statement that underscored what I said earlier, that in the region, democracy was really understood not only as a form of government, but as a driver of social and economic change. Agreements can always be reformed in one fashion. I would actually, however, go past reform of the Inter-American Democratic Charter and really think that it's time for the United States to begin to associate itself with the cultural, economic, and social rights that have been articulated throughout the hemisphere in instruments that typically the United States has not been party to. But that if we are really going to capture the potential of democracy as a socially transformative form of government, we need to understand that the rights that people hold dear, especially in Latin America, go far beyond what we would typically call political rights, but include the social, cultural, and economic rights that they define as human rights.
Great.
President
Thank you,
Chinchilla.
Ambassador.
Okay. Well, I basically agree with what Ambassador Shannon had already said about the integration mechanisms, and I don't think that we should be thinking about creating new initiatives. What is most important is to try to strengthen some of them. For me, the best model we have created in the region probably is the Pacific Alliance. The integration process in Central America is not bad. It has been interrupted by all the problems we have inside the region, but in general terms, it's a very well-conceived integration process. And what is important is to set the goals and forget about not only the structures, but also about ideology, because sometimes what it seems to me that what moves some of the countries from time to time is ideology, are more negative ideas rather than the positive ideas that the integration processes are supposed to foster. Concerning the relationship between the United States, Latin America, the interventionist positions that we are now hearing again, those are not very good times, I will say, for in general terms, for the relations between United States and Latin America. We were able to have a balance here in Washington for many years. I remember that, the Republicans were very good at promoting, in general terms, free trade agreements, and the Democrats were more concerned about the issues of human rights and democracy. And also, there were more awareness about how to deal in a more balanced way about the immigration problems. Now it seems to be that we lost all the balances. So we hear we hear more and more some talking against immigration, against democracy, or not very strong commitments. Although I have to make the assumption of Venezuela, we could talk a little more about that. But in general terms, it doesn't seem to be the true message to the region in encouraging and strengthening democracy, democratic values. And also, we are seeing some kind of protectionist ideas, which also create a very important menace in a region which has been very open to external markets. And most in the northern part of America, most of that market is the United States. So that balance was lost, and that creates uncertainty in our region. Again, of course, I am against any kind of military intervention, and I think the Venezuela problem, the Venezuela issue, in a certain way, I will say that we were not able to see in Venezuela at least three aspects aligned to look for a way to go out of the problem they have, to go out of the authoritarian regime. And those three issues were a unified opposition, a mobilized population, and finally, an international community aware of the problem and willing to implement economic and political sanctions. For first time, I have the feeling that we have the three things, and they are aligned. So the question is, what else we should do? And I think it is time probably to explore some other ways to try to figure out who are the right people that are behind Maduro, the people who are truly supporting Maduro, and to try to move with certain kind of, messages to them. I don't think that there are any justifications to have a military action. Of course, many of us are very concerned about the humanitarian crisis. And also, I think that the United Nations should be doing much more about attending those situations. And finally, your final question, my dear friend, which is for probably one more session, if democracy is more resilient or not. It is not yes or no. I would love to answer in such a way. But I will say that Nicaragua and Venezuela, but basically Venezuela, teaches us that no democracy is saved in the region. Because remember that in the 1970s, we only had 3 democracies in the region: Colombia, Costa Rica, and Venezuela. So we never imagined that this situation was going to happen in that country. I very much agree with Ambassador Shannon's vision that we have to be able to move from institutional democracy, democratic governments, to a democratic society. For me, the key, if we want to sustain the democratic institutions in the region, is investing in the people, investing in some kind of civic education, trying to mobilize the people and try to inspire them through some forms of participative democracy. I'm not talking about populist democracy, but some kind of mechanism so people can really feel that they are part of the day-by-day decision-making processes. But no democracy is saved if we do not understand that we have to do much more in terms of getting a society aware of the risk of some of the decisions they make when they vote.
Great.
Okay.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. I want to invite everybody for wine and cheese reception. I want to thank everybody for coming. I think it's been a terrific discussion. I hope you read the book. I hope you enjoyed the book, and I hope the book makes you think. That was the idea behind it. Let me give a special thanks to, Secretary Shannon, just to respond to Ambassador Towell, and to President Chinchilla for their excellent remarks today. Please join me in thanking them.